I'd been living in Riverside Meadows for about 3 years when this whole mess started. It was one of those cookie-cutter suburban neighborhoods with identical houses, perfectly trimmed lawns, and a beautiful man-made lake right in the middle of everything. That lake was actually the main reason I bought my house there. I'm a simple guy who loves fishing, and having water right in my backyard was a dream come true. Every Saturday and Sunday morning, weather permitting, I'd grab my tackle box and head down to the East Dock. It was my ritual, my way of starting the weekend right. There was something peaceful about watching the sun come up over that water, feeling the cool morning air and waiting for that first bite. I'd been doing this since the week I moved in, and nobody had ever said a word about it. The HOA rules were pretty clear too. I'm not the kind of person who breaks rules or causes trouble, so before I ever cast my first line, I read through that entire boring rulebook they gave me at closing. Section 7.3 specifically said residents could fish from the designated dock areas during daylight hours. It even mentioned that fishing was encouraged as part of the community's outdoor recreation activities. I remember feeling relieved when I read that, because I'd lived in neighborhoods before where they were strict about everything. So there I was on this particular Saturday morning in late May. The weather was perfect, not too hot yet, with just a light breeze coming across the water. I had my folding chair set up, my favorite rod and reel ready to go, and a thermos full of hot coffee sitting next to me. I'd already been there about 45 minutes and had caught 2 small bass, which I'd released back into the water like I always did. I wasn't even keeping the fish, just enjoying the sport of it. I was in the middle of reeling in my line to change my lure when I noticed someone walking toward me from the parking area. At first, I didn't think much of it. People walked around the lake all the time for exercise or just to enjoy the view. But as this person got closer, I realized it was Patricia, the HOA president. Everyone in the neighborhood knew who she was because she took her position very seriously. Maybe a little too seriously if you ask me. Patricia was one of those people who seemed to live for HOA business. She was always sending out emails about some violation or another, always organizing committees and subcommittees, always reminding everyone about rules we already knew. I'd never had any personal problems with her before this day. We'd waved to each other at community events, exchanged pleasantries at the mailbox, normal neighbor stuff. But something about the way she was walking toward me that morning made me nervous. She had her phone pressed against her ear, and even from a distance, I could see she was angry about something. Her other hand was gesturing wildly in the air, the way people do when they're having a heated conversation. I figured she was dealing with some HOA emergency, and just happened to be walking past the lake. Maybe someone had painted their front door the wrong color or left their trash cans out too long. Those were the kinds of things that usually got her worked up. But then she pointed directly at me while talking on the phone, and my stomach dropped. I set down my fishing rod and stood up, trying to figure out what I could have possibly done wrong. My area was clean, I wasn't being loud, and I was literally doing exactly what the HOA rules said I was allowed to do. None of it made any sense. Before I could even call out to ask what was wrong, I heard sirens in the distance. They were getting closer, and my confusion turned into genuine concern. Sirens in our quiet neighborhood were rare. We're talking about a place where the most exciting thing that usually happens is someone's cat getting stuck in a tree. But those sirens were definitely coming our way, and they were getting louder by the second. 2 police cruisers pulled into the lakeside parking area with their lights flashing. My heart was racing now. I'm a law-abiding citizen. I've never been in trouble with the police. The sight of those cars showing up while I'm doing something as innocent as fishing made me feel like I was in some kind of alternate reality. This couldn't be happening. This had to be about something else. Patricia was still on her phone, now talking even more animatedly and pointing at me repeatedly. That's when it hit me like a ton of bricks. She had called the police on me for fishing in my own neighborhood, in a spot where I was explicitly allowed to fish according to the HOA's own rules. The officers got out of their cars, and I could see the confusion on their faces. They looked around the peaceful lake area, looked at me standing there with my fishing rod, looked at Patricia, who was now marching toward them, and I could tell they were trying to figure out why they'd been called here. One of the officers was older, probably in his 50s, with gray hair and a weathered face that suggested he'd seen everything. The other was younger, maybe late 20s, and looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I stayed right where I was, my hands visible, trying to look as non-threatening as possible. My tackle box was open beside my chair. My coffee thermos was sitting there, and my 2 caught and released bass were long gone back into the water. There was literally nothing about this scene that should have required police intervention. Patricia reached the officers before they could walk over to me. I couldn't hear everything she was saying, but her voice carried across the water. Words like trespassing and violation and repeatedly warned floated over to me. That last one really got me because she had never warned me about anything. Not once in 3 years had she or anyone else suggested there was a problem with me fishing there. The officers started walking toward me, and I felt this weird mix of embarrassment and anger. Embarrassed because other residents were starting to come out of their houses to see what all the commotion was about. Angry because I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, and yet here I was, being treated like some kind of criminal for enjoying a peaceful morning of fishing. As they got closer, I could see the older officer's expression soften a bit. He glanced back at Patricia, then at me, then at my modest fishing setup, and I swear I saw him suppress a sigh. It was the look of someone who knew they'd been called out for something ridiculous but had to follow through anyway, because that's the job. This was really happening. The police were actually here because the HOA president had called them on me for fishing. In that moment, standing there by the lake with my coffee getting cold and my peaceful morning completely ruined, I realized my quiet life in Riverside Meadows was about to get a lot more complicated. The 2 officers reached my fishing spot, and I could tell right away that they were just as confused as I was. The older one spoke first, his voice calm and professional. He asked me if I lived in the neighborhood, and I nodded, pointing to my house, which was visible from where we were standing. Then he asked if I knew why they'd been called, and I honestly told him I had no idea except that I was fishing, which I'd been doing here for 3 years without any problems. Patricia came rushing over before the officer could respond. She was out of breath, her face red, and she immediately launched into this long explanation about how I was breaking community rules and trespassing on HOA property. The way she said it made it sound like I'd broken into someone's private pond or something. She kept using phrases like unauthorized use and violation of community standards, as if I was running some kind of illegal operation instead of just sitting in a chair with a fishing rod. I let her finish because I didn't want to interrupt and make things worse. The officers were listening, taking notes, and I noticed the younger one kept glancing at my simple setup like he was trying to figure out what the big deal was. When Patricia finally stopped talking, the older officer turned to me and asked for my side of the story. This is where I'm really glad I'm the kind of person who keeps good records. I pulled out my phone and opened up the folder where I'd saved all my important documents. I showed the officers the HOA bylaws that I'd downloaded as a PDF file when I first moved in. I scrolled right to section 7.3 and let them read it for themselves. The rule was written in plain English, stating that residents were allowed to fish from designated dock areas during daylight hours. It even mentioned that fishing was encouraged as a recreational activity. The older officer read it carefully, then handed my phone to his partner so he could read it too. Then he asked me which dock this was, and I explained that this was the East Dock, one of 3 designated fishing areas around the lake. I even showed them the small sign posted near the dock entrance that had a little fish symbol on it, indicating it was a fishing area. That sign had been there since I moved in, probably longer. Patricia's whole demeanor changed when the officers read the bylaws. She started backtracking, saying that there must be a newer version of the rules, or that there had been a recent change that I wasn't aware of. The older officer asked her if she had any documentation of these new rules, and she fumbled with her phone, scrolling through what I assumed were emails and documents. She couldn't find anything, because there was nothing to find. The rules hadn't changed. Then she tried a different approach. She claimed that I'd been fishing at inappropriate times, making too much noise and disturbing other residents. The younger officer actually looked at me and asked in the most deadpan voice if I'd been making noise while fishing. I almost laughed but managed to keep a straight face. I told him that fishing is pretty much the quietest activity there is, and that I'd been sitting here peacefully for less than an hour, barely making a sound. The older officer closed his notebook and turned to Patricia with a look that clearly said he was not happy about being called out here. He explained, very patiently, that this was a civil matter between me and the HOA, not a criminal issue. He said that they couldn't enforce HOA rules, and that if there was a dispute about community regulations, it needed to be handled through proper HOA channels. not by calling the police. Patricia's face went from red to almost purple. She insisted that there had to be something they could do, that I was clearly in the wrong somehow, that she was the HOA president and she knew the rules better than anyone. The officer remained calm but firm. He told her that based on the documentation I'd shown them and the clear signage indicating this was a fishing area, there was no violation occurring. He suggested that if she believed I was breaking HOA rules, she should schedule a board meeting or send me a formal notice through proper channels. I could see Patricia was furious, but there wasn't much she could do at that point. The officers had made it clear they weren't going to take any action. Before they left, the older officer quietly pulled me aside out of Patricia's earshot. He told me that I should document everything that happened today, including taking photos of the signage, saving the bylaws, and writing down the timeline of events. He said it in a way that suggested he'd seen situations like this escalate before, and he wanted me to be prepared. I thanked him for the advice, and both officers headed back to their cars. Patricia stood there for a moment, looking like she was trying to figure out her next move. Then she turned to me, pointed her finger, and said in this really aggressive tone that this wasn't over. She said she was going to look into this further and that I'd be hearing from the HOA board. Then she stormed off toward the parking lot, her shoes clicking angrily on the pavement. After she left, I just stood there for a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened. My peaceful Saturday morning had turned into a full-blown confrontation with police involvement. A few neighbors had gathered at a distance watching the whole thing unfold, and I could see them talking among themselves. This was going to be the talk of the neighborhood for weeks. I packed up my fishing gear even though I'd planned to stay for another hour. The mood was ruined, and I couldn't shake this feeling of being targeted for absolutely no reason. As I walked back to my house, I thought about all those mornings I'd spent at that dock. 3 years of peaceful fishing, 3 years of never bothering anyone, 3 years of following the rules to the letter. And now suddenly I was being treated like some kind of troublemaker. When I got home, I took the officer's advice seriously. I sat down at my computer and started documenting everything. I wrote down exactly what happened, what time the police arrived, what was said by everyone involved. I went back through my phone and found photos I'd taken over the years of me fishing at that same spot. I had dozens of them, pictures of fish I'd caught, sunrise shots over the lake, even a few selfies I'd sent to friends. Each photo had a timestamp and location data embedded in it. Then I started going through my email archives. I remembered that when I first moved in, I'd actually emailed the HOA to confirm that fishing was allowed. The president at that time, a friendly guy named Robert, had responded enthusiastically, telling me that fishing was absolutely permitted and that they were happy to have residents using the lake. I'd saved that email and now I was really glad I had. I found more emails too. Messages about community events held near the lake. Newsletters that mentioned fishing as one of the amenities of living in Riverside Meadows. Annual reports that highlighted the lake and its recreational opportunities. Every single piece of documentation supported my right to fish there. That evening, right before dinner, I got an email from the HOA board. My heart sank when I saw the subject line, "Official Notice of Violation." I opened it and couldn't believe what I was reading. They were threatening to fine me $500 for disturbing the peace and creating a public nuisance. $500 for fishing in a spot where I was explicitly allowed to fish. The email was written in this formal, legal-sounding language that was clearly meant to intimidate me. It referenced multiple rule violations without actually specifying what rules I'd broken. It gave me 10 days to pay the fine or face additional penalties, including potential legal action. The whole thing was signed by Patricia as HOA president, though it was sent on behalf of the entire board. I read that email 3 times, getting angrier each time. This wasn't about rules or regulations anymore. This was personal. Patricia had been embarrassed in front of the police officers and in front of the neighbors, and now she was retaliating. She was using her position as HOA president to punish me for making her look bad, even though I hadn't done anything wrong. But I wasn't going to just roll over and accept this. I'd spent years following the rules, being a good neighbor, and minding my own business. If Patricia wanted to turn this into a battle, then fine. I had documentation, I had evidence, and I had 3 years of proof that I'd never violated any rule. This fight was just beginning, and I was ready for whatever came next. I spent most of Sunday going through every email, every document, and every photo I had related to my fishing at the lake. By the end of the day, I had built what I thought was a pretty solid case. I'd fished at that lake exactly 147 times over 3 years. I know that sounds obsessive, but I actually kept a fishing journal where I logged each trip, what I caught, and the conditions. It was just a hobby thing I did, never thinking it would actually matter someday. I had photos from at least 60 of those trips. Every single one showed me at the same dock doing the same thing, never causing any trouble. Some of the photos even had other residents in the background, waving or giving me a thumbs up. There was one picture from last summer where old Mr. Henderson from 2 streets over had stopped to chat with me about the bass he used to catch when he was younger. Another showed a family with their kids watching me reel in a fish, the kids all excited and pointing. But the most important thing I found was those email exchanges with Robert, the previous HOA president. When I'd first moved in, I'd been cautious about everything. I didn't want to step on any toes or break any rules in my new neighborhood. So I'd sent him a detailed email asking about fishing permissions, what times were acceptable, whether I needed any kind of permit, all of that. His response had been wonderful. He'd written back saying that fishing was not only allowed but encouraged. He'd even mentioned that they'd specifically designed the 3 dock areas with fishing in mind and that they hoped more residents would take advantage of the lake. That email was dated 3 weeks after I'd moved in, and it was crystal clear. There was no ambiguity, no restrictions beyond the basic daylight hours rule. Nothing that suggested what I'd been doing was wrong in any way. I had been given explicit permission by the HOA leadership at the time, and that permission had never been revoked. On Monday morning, I decided to take action. I wasn't going to just respond to Patricia's threatening email. I was going to go over her head and make sure the entire HOA board knew what was happening. I composed a detailed email that included everything: the timeline of events from Saturday morning, copies of the relevant bylaws, screenshots of all my documentation, and those crucial emails from Robert. I even included the names and badge numbers of the 2 police officers who'd responded, in case anyone wanted to verify my story. Instead of sending it just to Patricia, I sent it to every single member of the HOA board. There were 7 of them in total, and their email addresses were listed on the community website. In my email, I was polite but firm. I explained that I was requesting a formal hearing to contest the fine and to address what I believed was a misuse of HOA authority. I made it clear that I had no intention of paying a fine for an activity I was explicitly permitted to do. The response was faster than I expected. Within 2 hours, I got an email from someone named Todd, who was the board's secretary. He apologized for the situation and said he hadn't been aware of Patricia's plan to call the police. He mentioned that the board would be discussing this at their next meeting, and that he'd personally make sure my request for a hearing was added to the agenda. Then, about an hour after that, I got a phone call from another board member, Jennifer. She sounded genuinely concerned and a bit embarrassed. She told me that she'd spoken with 2 other board members and none of them had been consulted about the fine. Patricia had apparently sent that violation notice on her own, without board approval. Jennifer said that wasn't how things were supposed to work, and she assured me that they'd get this sorted out. What really surprised me was when I got a 3rd message, this time from Brian, another board member. He asked if we could meet for coffee, and something in his tone made me agree. We met that afternoon at a local coffee shop, away from the neighborhood where people might overhear us. Brian looked uncomfortable as we sat down with our drinks. He thanked me for meeting him and then got straight to the point. He told me that I wasn't the first person to have problems with Patricia. Over the past year, she'd become increasingly aggressive about enforcement, often making decisions without consulting the rest of the board. He mentioned that several residents had complained privately, but nobody wanted to rock the boat or deal with the drama of challenging an HOA president. He told me about Mrs. Wilson, an elderly woman who'd been threatened with a fine because her grandkids had left their bikes in her driveway for a few hours. Patricia had taken photos and sent her a nasty email about how the bikes were an eyesore and violated the community's aesthetic standards. Mrs. Wilson had been so upset that she'd cried at the next board meeting. There was also the situation with the Thompsons, a young couple who'd painted their front door a shade of blue that Patricia claimed wasn't on the approved color list. She demanded they repaint it within a week or face daily fines. When Brian had looked into it, he'd found that the color was actually within the acceptable range, But Patricia had been using an outdated color chart. He shared story after story, and I realized that what had happened to me was part of a much bigger pattern. Patricia had turned the HOA presidency into her own personal fiefdom, and she was wielding her power like a weapon. The problem was that most residents were too intimidated to fight back, and the other board members had been trying to handle things quietly to avoid conflict. Brian admitted that calling the police on me might have been the breaking point they needed. It was so over the top, so clearly unreasonable, that it couldn't be swept under the rug. He asked me if I'd be willing to speak at the next board meeting and share my story publicly. He thought that if other residents heard what happened, it might give them the courage to come forward with their own experiences. I agreed immediately. I'd gone into this just wanting to fish in peace, but now I was seeing that this was about more than just me. This was about an HOA president who'd gone rogue and was making life miserable for people who just wanted to enjoy their homes. Over the next few days, word spread through the neighborhood about what had happened. I don't know how, but suddenly people I barely knew were stopping me when I checked my mail or walked my dog. They wanted to hear my side of the story. They wanted to share their own frustrations with Patricia's leadership. It felt like everyone had been waiting for someone to stand up to her, and my fishing incident had become the catalyst. One neighbor told me about being fined for having a garden gnome in her flower bed because it violated some obscure decoration rule. Another said he'd been harassed for parking his work truck in his own driveway because Patricia thought it looked unprofessional. A guy from 3 streets over mentioned that he'd been planning to sell his house, partly because he was so tired of dealing with HOA drama. The community Facebook group, which I rarely checked, was blowing up with discussions about HOA overreach. People were sharing their stories, comparing notes on Patricia's behavior and rallying support for reform. Someone even created a poll asking if Patricia should remain as president, and the results were overwhelmingly against her. Through it all, Patricia remained silent. She didn't respond to any of the board members who'd reached out to her about my case. She didn't acknowledge the growing discontent in the community. She just sent out her regular emails about upcoming events and rule reminders, acting like nothing was wrong. The board meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening, just 10 days after the fishing incident. Brian had told me that they were expecting a big turnout, but I wasn't prepared for what I saw when I arrived at the community center that night. The parking lot was completely full and people were walking from blocks away. There had to be at least 50 residents there, maybe more. Inside, every chair was taken and people were standing along the walls. The energy in the room was electric, a mixture of anticipation and frustration that had been building for months. I saw Mrs. Wilson sitting in the front row, looking nervous but determined. The Thompsons were there too, along with faces I recognized from around the neighborhood and many I didn't. Patricia sat at the board table looking composed, but I could see tension in her shoulders. The other board members looked uncomfortable, like they knew this was going to be a long and difficult night. As the meeting was called to order and the agenda was reviewed, I realized this wasn't just about my right to fish anymore. This was about whether our community was going to be ruled by fear and petty tyranny, or whether residents were going to take back control of their own neighborhood, and it was all about to come to a head. The board meeting started with the usual formalities, reading the minutes from the last meeting and going through routine business items. But everyone in that packed room knew we weren't there for routine business. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. People were shifting in their seats, whispering to each other, waiting for the real discussion to begin. Finally, Todd, the board secretary, announced that they'd be addressing a special matter regarding a recent incident involving a resident and a disputed HOA violation. That was my cue. My heart was pounding as I stood up and walked to the front of the room. I'd never been much of a public speaker, and having 50-plus people staring at me was nerve-wracking. But I reminded myself why I was there and took a deep breath. I started by calmly explaining what had happened that Saturday morning. I didn't exaggerate or add drama. I just told the truth. I described setting up my fishing gear at the East Dock, the same spot I'd been using for 3 years. I explained how Patricia had approached me while on the phone, and how 2 police cruisers had shown up moments later. I mentioned the confusion on the officers' faces and how I'd shown them the HOA bylaws that clearly permitted fishing. Then I pulled up the documents on my tablet and passed it to the board members so they could see for themselves. I showed them the section of the bylaws about fishing, the emails from Robert welcoming me to fish at the lake, and the photos documenting my 147 fishing trips over 3 years. I also showed them the violation notice threatening me with a $500 fine for disturbing the peace and creating a public nuisance. The room was completely silent as I spoke. You could have heard a pin drop. When I finished, I simply asked the board to rescind the fine and to acknowledge that I had never violated any HOA rules. Then I sat down, my hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline. Before the board could respond, Mrs. Wilson stood up. Her voice was trembling, but she spoke with conviction. She told everyone about her grandchildren's bikes and how Patricia had made her feel like a criminal for having her own family visit. She talked about how she'd been afraid to have her grandkids over after that, worried about what other complaints might come. There were tears in her eyes as she described feeling unwelcome in her own home. Then another resident stood up, and another and another. It was like a dam had broken. Person after person shared their experiences with Patricia's enforcement tactics. A man named Chris talked about being fined for having his lawn furniture arranged in a way Patricia deemed inappropriate, even though there was no rule about furniture placement. A woman named Rachel described being harassed about the type of flowers she'd planted in her front yard, with Patricia claiming they weren't on some approved plant list that nobody else had ever heard of. One guy, a military veteran named Frank, got really emotional as he talked about how Patricia had threatened to fine him for displaying an American flag on his porch. She'd claimed it was too large and violated decoration guidelines. He'd served his country for 20 years, and being told he couldn't properly display the flag had been deeply hurtful. The room erupted in supportive applause when he finished speaking. Patricia tried to defend herself several times during all of this, but each time she was met with more examples of her overreach. She claimed she was just enforcing the rules as written, but people kept pointing out that she was either making up rules that didn't exist or interpreting existing rules in the most extreme way possible. She insisted that she was trying to maintain property values, but residents countered that her actions were actually making people want to move out of the neighborhood. At one point, she tried to shift blame, suggesting that the board had approved all of her actions. That's when Brian spoke up. He'd been sitting quietly, letting the residents have their say, but now he looked directly at Patricia and said that wasn't true. He explained that many of her recent enforcement actions, including the fine she'd attempted to levy against me, had been done without board approval or even board knowledge. He said that an HOA president wasn't supposed to act unilaterally like that, and that her behavior had violated their own governance procedures. Jennifer, the board member who'd called me earlier in the week, backed Brian up. She pulled out copies of their bylaws and pointed to the sections about how decisions were supposed to be made. Major enforcement actions required a vote by the board, not just the president's say-so. Fines over a certain amount needed board approval. Calling the police on a resident should have been discussed with at least some board members first, except in genuine emergencies. Patricia had bypassed all of that. Todd added that he'd gone back through the records and found multiple instances over the past 18 months where Patricia had issued fines or violation notices without board approval. Some residents had paid those fines, probably because they didn't know they had the right to contest them or because they were too intimidated to fight back. The total amount collected from these questionable fines was over $8,000. That number stunned everyone in the room. $8,000 in fines that may not have been legitimate. People started calling out, asking if they could get refunds, asking what had happened to that money, asking how this had been allowed to go on for so long. The meeting was starting to feel less like a formal board meeting and more like a town hall uprising. Patricia's composure finally cracked. She stood up, her face red, and started shouting about how ungrateful everyone was. She said she'd devoted countless hours to the HOA, that she'd been trying to make the neighborhood better, that nobody appreciated how hard she worked. She claimed that people like me were troublemakers who didn't respect community standards. She even suggested that the reason people were complaining was because they wanted to turn the neighborhood into a rundown mess. But her outburst only made things worse. People started calling for her resignation. They wanted her removed as president immediately. The chants grew louder, and the other board members looked at each other with expressions that clearly said they agreed. This had gone too far, and there was no coming back from it. The board called for a brief recess to discuss things privately. Everyone stayed in their seats, though, too invested in seeing this through. People were talking excitedly, comparing notes, expressing relief that they weren't alone in their frustrations. Mrs. Wilson came over and hugged me, thanking me for speaking up. Several other people shook my hand or patted me on the back. I felt like I'd accidentally become the face of a movement I never intended to start. When the board came back, their decision was clear. Todd announced that they were immediately rescinding my fine and issuing a formal apology. He said that after reviewing the evidence, it was obvious that I had never violated any HOA rules, and that the entire incident should never have happened. That got applause from the room. Then Brian stood up for the more significant announcement. He said that the board had voted, and they were removing Patricia from her position as president, effective immediately. The vote had been 6-1, with Patricia being the only vote against her own removal. The room erupted in cheers. People were actually standing and applauding. It felt surreal, like something you'd see in a movie rather than a suburban HOA meeting. Patricia gathered her things and stormed out of the room without another word. A few people booed as she left, but most just watched in silence, a mixture of relief and satisfaction on their faces. The woman who'd made so many of them miserable was finally being held accountable. The meeting continued for another hour. Brian was voted in as the new president with unanimous support. He immediately announced some changes. First, they'd be reviewing every fine and violation notice issued over the past 2 years to determine which ones were legitimate. Anyone who'd been wrongly fined would receive a full refund. Second, they were going to revise their enforcement procedures to include more checks and balances, so no single person could ever wield that much unchecked power again. Third, they'd be updating the community website to make all rules and bylaws easily accessible and clearly written, so there'd be no more confusion about what was and wasn't allowed. Jennifer suggested they form a residents committee that would have input on HOA decisions, and that idea was met with enthusiastic approval. People wanted to feel like they had a voice in their own community again. They wanted transparency and fairness, not fear and arbitrary enforcement. As the meeting finally wrapped up and people started filing out, there was an atmosphere of celebration mixed with exhaustion. We'd all been through something together, and we'd come out the other side with real change. People were smiling, shaking hands, making plans to actually get to know their neighbors better, instead of avoiding each other out of fear of HOA complaints. I walked out into the cool night air feeling lighter than I had in days. What had started as a simple Saturday morning fishing trip had somehow turned into a catalyst for transformation in our entire community. Sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone, even when you never meant to start a revolution. The weeks following that memorable board meeting brought more changes to Riverside Meadows than I'd seen in my entire 3 years of living there. It was like the whole neighborhood had woken up from a long sleep and decided to actually become a community, instead of just a collection of houses with strict rules. Brian turned out to be exactly the kind of president we needed. His first week in office, he sent out a detailed email to every resident explaining what had happened and outlining the new direction for the HOA. He acknowledged that things had gotten out of hand and apologized on behalf of the board for letting it go on so long. But more importantly, he laid out concrete steps for how things were going to change. The fine review process started immediately. Brian and 2 other board members went through every violation notice and fine issued over the past 2 years. They contacted each person who'd been fined and asked them to explain their situation. It turned out that more than half of the fines had been questionable at best, and many were for violations of rules that didn't actually exist or had been misinterpreted beyond recognition. Mrs. Wilson got a full refund for the fine she'd paid over her grandchildren's bikes. The couple who'd repainted their front door got reimbursed for both the fine and the cost of the unnecessary paint job. Frank, the veteran, received a personal apology letter and was told he could display his American flag with pride. Any size he wanted, any time he wanted. Watching people get their money back and their dignity restored was incredibly satisfying. In total, the board refunded over $6,000 to residents who'd been wrongly fined. The remaining $2,000 from questionable fines hadn't been paid yet, so those notices were simply voided. Some people tried to give their refunds back to the HOA, saying they just wanted things to be fair and didn't need the money. But Brian insisted everyone take their refunds. He said it was about principle, not just money. The new enforcement procedures were completely different from before. Now, before any fine could be issued, there had to be photographic evidence of the violation, clear documentation of which rule was being violated, and approval from at least 3 board members. Residents would receive a friendly warning first, giving them time to correct the issue before any penalties were applied. And every resident had the right to appeal any decision at a board meeting, with their case heard publicly. They also created a new Residents Advisory Committee, and I got asked to be on it. I wasn't sure at first because I'd never been the type to get involved in HOA politics. I just wanted to fish in peace, remember? But people kept telling me that my willingness to stand up had made all this possible, and I felt some responsibility to help make sure things stayed on track. So I accepted, along with 9 other residents who wanted to help rebuild trust in our community. The HOA website got a complete overhaul. All the rules and bylaws were posted in plain English, with examples and clarifications so there'd be no more confusion. They added a FAQ section where residents could ask questions anonymously, and board members would respond publicly so everyone could benefit from the answers. They even created a suggestion box feature where people could propose changes or improvements without fear of retaliation. But the best changes weren't the official ones. They were the way people started actually connecting with each other. Before all this, most of us would just wave politely and keep to ourselves. Now people were stopping to chat, sharing stories, helping each other out. The neighborhood Facebook group went from being a place where people complained about violations to being a place where people organized potlucks and play dates. Someone suggested we start having regular community events at the lake, and that idea took off immediately. The first one was a fishing day where anyone could come learn basic fishing techniques. I volunteered to help teach, and we had about 15 people show up, including a bunch of kids. Watching those kids get excited about catching their first fish reminded me why I loved fishing in the first place. It wasn't just about the fish. It was about the peace, the connection with nature, and now, the connection with neighbors. We started having those fishing events once a month, and they became really popular. Some Saturdays we'd have 30 or 40 people at the lake, from little kids with their parents to retirees who hadn't fished in decades. People would bring snacks to share, and it turned into this casual, friendly gathering that nobody wanted to miss. The lake went from being this beautiful but underused amenity to being the heart of our community. Mrs. Wilson started bringing her grandchildren to these events, and seeing her smiling and relaxed, not worried about rule violations, made me realize how much damage the old way of doing things had caused. Her grandkids loved fishing, and she'd bought them their own little fishing rods. One of them, a 7-year-old girl named Sophie, caught a bass almost as big as she was, and her shriek of joy could probably be heard 3 streets over. It was perfect. The Thompsons, the couple with the blue door, became good friends of mine. Turns out we had a lot in common beyond our HOA troubles. They invited me over for dinner one night, and we spent hours talking about everything except HOA drama. It felt good to actually know my neighbors as people, not just as houses I passed on my way home. About 2 months after everything went down, I was at my usual spot on the East Dock on a Sunday morning. The weather was beautiful. The fish were biting, and I'd already caught and released 3 decent-sized bass. I was thinking about how much had changed since that crazy Saturday when the police showed up, and I couldn't help but smile. That's when I heard footsteps on the dock behind me. I turned around and saw Patricia walking toward me. My first instinct was to tense up, prepare for another confrontation. But something about her body language was different. She looked smaller somehow, less aggressive, almost hesitant. She stopped a few feet away and stood there for a moment without saying anything. Then quietly she apologized. She said she'd been wrong about everything, that she'd let the power of being HOA president go to her head, and that she'd made a lot of people miserable, including herself. She said she'd been so focused on enforcing rules and maintaining standards that she'd forgotten we were supposed to be a community, not a dictatorship. I didn't know what to say at first. This was the woman who'd called the cops on me for fishing, who'd tried to fine me $500, who'd made life difficult for dozens of residents. But looking at her now, I saw someone who was genuinely remorseful and probably pretty lonely. Power can corrupt people, but losing it can humble them too. I told her I appreciated the apology, and I meant it. I didn't say we were suddenly best friends or that everything was forgotten, but I acknowledged that it took courage to come here and say what she'd said. She nodded, thanked me for listening, and started to walk away. Then she turned back and asked if the monthly fishing events were open to everyone. I told her they were, that everyone was welcome. She said maybe she'd come to the next one, and I said that would be fine. I don't know if she ever did come to a fishing event. I haven't seen her at one yet, but that's okay. The point is that she asked and I welcomed her, because that's what communities are supposed to do. We're supposed to give people chances to do better. 3 months after this all started, I was sitting at that same dock on a Saturday morning, but this time I wasn't alone. There were 4 other people fishing nearby, including Frank the veteran and his grandson. A family was having a picnic at one of the tables by the shore. A couple was walking their dog along the path that circled the lake. Kids were playing on the small beach area, their laughter carrying across the water. Brian walked by and stopped to see if I'd caught anything. We chatted for a few minutes about the upcoming HOA meeting, which was actually going to be boring for once because there was no drama, just routine business. He thanked me again for speaking up when it mattered, and I told him I was just glad everything had worked out. As I sat there with my fishing line in the water, surrounded by the sounds of a happy community, I realized that sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest acts of standing up for what's right. I just wanted to fish in peace, but by refusing to back down from an unjust fine, I'd accidentally helped transform an entire neighborhood. I caught a beautiful 5-pound bass that morning. It was one of the biggest I'd ever pulled from that lake, and I took a quick photo before releasing it back into the water. As I watched it swim away strong and free, I thought about how appropriate that was. Sometimes you need to fight to protect what matters, but once you've won, the best thing you can do is let go and just enjoy the peace you've earned. The lake was still there. The fish were still there, and I was still there, fishing from the same dock I'd always loved. But everything else had changed for the better. And every time I cast my line into that water, I'm reminded that standing up for yourself isn't just about you. It's about everyone who comes after you, everyone who needs someone to go first, everyone who's waiting for permission to believe that things can actually get better. All I wanted was to fish. What I got was a community, and honestly, that's an even better catch.